There is one country in the world that is standing in the way of peace and preventing the war in Gaza from ending, and that is the United States. The USA has repeatedly vetoed resolutions in the United Nations Security Council that call for peace and a ceasefire in Gaza. The latest example was on the 18th of September, when 14 of the 15 members of the Security Council voted for a resolution that called for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, including the unconditional release of all hostages. 14 of the 15 members supported this resolution. The United States was the only country that opposed the resolution, and the US had veto power, so it killed the resolution. This was the 6th time in less than 2 years that the US used its veto power to prevent peace in Gaza. And I have to emphasize, this is not just the Donald Trump administration. The previous Joe Biden administration also vetoed 4 UN Security Council resolutions to continue the war in Gaza. And in less than 1 year, the Trump administration has vetoed another 2. And this is just since October 2023, in slightly under 2 years, 6 vetoes. By the way, China was one of the countries that was loudly calling for peace in Gaza, and China voted in support of this resolution. And China's ambassador to the UN criticized the US veto. He said, quote, "China is deeply disappointed by the result of today's vote. The conflict in Gaza has been dragging on for nearly 2 years, causing an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. Time and again, the Security Council has attempted to take actions only to be forcefully blocked by the United States. How many more innocent lives must be lost before a ceasefire can be achieved in Gaza?" End quote. In its report on this latest US veto, the UN news agency pointed out that this is coming at a time when famine is spreading across the Gaza Strip, and Israel, with the support of the US, is trying to take over all of Gaza with plans to ethnically cleanse, to expel 2 million indigenous Palestinians, to colonize all of their land and take it over. And by the way, the United Nations World Food Program officially confirmed in August 2025 that famine is now widespread in Gaza. The World Food Program wrote that, quote, "More than 500,000 people in Gaza are trapped in famine, marked by widespread starvation, destitution, and preventable deaths. By the end of September, more than 640,000 people will face catastrophic levels of food insecurity," end quote. And this famine is not just some accidental act of nature. This was an intentional man-made famine caused by Israel with the full support of the US government, because the US and Israel are using starvation of Palestinians as a weapon of war. And this is why even mainstream Western human rights organizations have said very clearly that Israel is using starvation to inflict genocide against the Palestinian people. Now, United Nations experts in international law have been warning for well over a year that this is a genocide that is happening in Gaza. But this September, a UN commission officially stated that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people in a devastating report that was published by the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I'm reading here from the report that the commission officially sent to the UN Human Rights Council. Quote, "The commission concludes on reasonable grounds that the Israeli authorities and Israeli security forces have committed and are continuing to commit the following actus reus of genocide against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip." And then the UN Commission outlined how Israel has committed 4 of the 5 crimes listed in the Genocide Convention that was established in 1948 after World War II, which, by the way, coincidentally was the same year that Israel was founded through the mass ethnic cleansing and killing of indigenous Palestinians in what was known as the Nakba, the catastrophe. So this Genocide Convention establishes, according to international law, how genocide is defined. And if a state commits any of the following 5 crimes, they are committing genocide. According to the UN Commission, Israel has committed the first 4 of these 5 crimes. 1. Killing members of the group, that is the Palestinians. 2. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, that is the Palestinians. 3. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or part. And 4. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. According to the UN Commission, Israel has committed these 4 crimes of genocide. The only one that it has not officially established Israel being guilty of yet is the 5th, which is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. However, I think that Israel could be found guilty of this in their near future as well, especially considering that we have reports that the U.S. government is working with Israel on plans to expel all 2 million Palestinians from Gaza, including Palestinian children. This is called ethnic cleansing. This is part of the U.S.-sponsored genocide that's being carried out. So if we go back to this report that was published by this UN commission, it states very clearly that, quote, the commission concludes that the Israeli authorities and Israeli security forces have had and continue to have the genocidal intent to destroy in whole or in part the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, end quote. This is as clear as it could possibly be. Israel is committing genocide with the full support of the U.S. government. And by the way, there was a section of this report in which the UN Commission emphasized, quote, the duty to prevent and punish genocide applies not only to the responsible state, but to all state parties to the Genocide Convention, and indeed to all states under customary international law, end quote. So this is another way of saying that the U.S. is complicit, and European countries that have been sending weapons to Israel, like Germany, they are complicit in carrying out genocide, in violating the Genocide Convention. And if that weren't already clear enough, the UN Commission also called on all member states to, quote, cease the transfer of arms and other equipment or items, including jet fuel, to the state of Israel, end quote. So this is a clear message from the UN Commission of international experts that the U.S. must stop sending weapons to Israel because the U.S. is helping Israel commit genocide. But, of course, the U.S. is a complete rogue state. The United States doesn't care what international law states, and the Donald Trump administration is planning to send another $6.4 billion of weapons to Israel. And this isn't just so-called aid. This is sales of weapons to benefit U.S. corporations in the military-industrial complex. So not only is the U.S. facilitating Israel's genocide, not only would this genocide not be possible without the U.S., but furthermore, U.S. corporations, U.S. capitalists are profiting from this genocide against the Palestinian people. And again, I have to emphasize that this is not just the Trump administration. Of course, Trump is currently in power. He's the one backing the genocide. But the genocide started back in October 2023, and for well over a year, it had the support of the Joe Biden administration. And from October 2023 until Biden left office in January 2025, in just over 1 year, the Biden administration sent more than $18 billion of so-called military aid to Israel. Although, again, I need to emphasize that a lot of that so-called aid is actually weapons sales, and Israel was buying these weapons and ammunition and other forms of military support from U.S. corporations that are profiting from this genocide. And I have to say that it was already obvious for well over a year that this was a genocide. This is not just a war that the U.S. and Israel are carrying out. This is a genocide against the Palestinian people. And now the world's leading experts on genocide have come to the same conclusion. The International Association of Genocide Scholars held a vote on a resolution condemning what the U.S. and Israel are doing in Gaza as a genocide, and 86% of members voted to support this resolution. That is the vast, vast majority of international legal experts and historical experts on genocide. And given how obvious this genocide is to everyone, it's being live streamed, international legal institutions have been trying to save face, trying to save their reputation, because they've done nothing to stop this U.S.-Israeli genocide. This is why finally, after over a year of genocide, in November 2024, the International Criminal Court finally issued arrest warrants for Israeli officials, including Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And what was the response of the U.S. government? The Biden administration was considering imposing sanctions on the International Criminal Court, the ICC. But then when Trump came in, just a few weeks after Trump's inauguration, in February, the Trump administration officially imposed sanctions on the ICC, which is an enormous slap in the face of international law. The U.S. is a rogue state. And this came after the International Court of Justice, which is the top UN legal authority located at The Hague. The ICJ made a similar decision in January 2024, stating that Israel can be investigated on accusations of committing genocide. This is after South Africa introduced a case at the ICJ accusing Israel of genocide, and that ICJ case now has the support of many countries in the global South, especially in Latin America. And the US and Israel have been blatantly, for well over a year, violating this ruling by judges at the International Court of Justice and continuing to carry out genocide and intentionally causing a famine to ethnically cleanse Palestinians and to colonize, to steal their land. The Washington Post got access to an internal report that is being circulated in the Trump administration where they make it clear that their goal is to expel all 2 million Palestinians from Gaza and to take over the territory. I'm reading here from the Washington Post, quote, "A post-war plan from Gaza circulating within the Trump administration, modeled on President Donald Trump's vow to take over the enclave, would turn it into a trusteeship administered by the United States for at least 10 years, while it is transformed into a gleaming tourism resort and high-tech manufacturing and technology hub," end quote. And this plan would involve a so-called temporary, in scare quotes, temporary relocation of all of Gaza's more than 2 million population. And of course, in the biggest euphemism of the century, the U.S. claims this would be voluntary relocation. But it's not voluntary when the U.S. and Israel have destroyed almost all of the homes and the residential buildings in Gaza. Palestinians are homeless. They have nowhere to live. Their family members have been killed. A huge percentage of the population has been killed. And then the U.S. and Israel are telling them, if you don't leave, you're all going to die. That's not voluntary. This is completely Orwellian fascist language that's being used by these genocidal regimes, the U.S. and Israel, that are blatantly carrying out a genocide, a 19th century style colonial genocide, and everyone in the world can see it, and yet there's no way to stop them because the U.S. empire is this massive rogue regime with the biggest military on earth that threatens the entire world. And with the full support of the genocidal U.S. rogue regime, the Israeli colonial regime is boasting of how they're going to expel Palestinians and turn Gaza into a, quote, real estate bonanza, end quote. I'm reading here from the BBC, quote, "Israel's far-right finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, has said that the Gaza Strip could be a real estate bonanza and that he is in talks with the U.S. about dividing up the territory after the war. Speaking at an event in Tel Aviv, he said, quote, "A business plan is on President Trump's table. We've done the demolition phase. Now we need to rebuild," he said, end quote. So again, these are 19th century style colonialists living in the 21st century. They are barbaric colonialists and fascists who plan to ethnically cleanse any Palestinians who survive and then colonize all of their territory. And then the Trump administration, the Trump family, want to profit from real estate deals built on the ethnically cleansed land where Palestinians lived. I mean, this is exactly what the United States itself did. The United States, as a colonial project, is built on the bones of the indigenous peoples who were killed and ethnically cleansed by the U.S. colonizers 200 years ago, continuing, this was a process that went over centuries. This is manifest destiny, this colonialist process, the biggest genocide in human history. And today, the U.S. empire is using Israel as an outpost of the U.S. empire to do the exact same thing to take over Gaza. Because the Trump administration's plan is that the U.S. will have control over Gaza, not even Israel. It will be the U.S. empire directly doing to the Palestinians exactly what the U.S. empire did to the Native Americans. And this genocidal rogue regime in Washington is withdrawing from all international institutions, so there's no way to stop this genocidal U.S. rogue regime. Trump has already withdrawn the U.S. from numerous UN bodies, including the Human Rights Council. Trump also withdrew the U.S. from UNESCO, another UN organization. And for the first time ever in history, Trump has also pulled the United States out of its United Nations Human Rights Review. I'm reading here from an article published in The Hill by an American human rights lawyer who previously worked for human rights organizations at the United Nations. He wrote that, quote, every 4.5 years on a revolving basis, each of the 193 member countries of the United Nations submits a report to the UN Human Rights Council on its domestic human rights record under international standards. And for the first time, one country, the United States, has refused to submit a national report or participate in the human rights dialogue, end quote. This expert in international law noted that the U.S. government has tried to justify its refusal to participate in this process by condemning the UN Human Rights Council for supposedly failing to condemn human rights violations committed by countries the U.S. doesn't like. But this expert in international law noted that, quote, this is exactly wrong. For the last 17 years since the universal review process began, every country the U.S. might consider a, quote, egregious human rights violator, end quote, including China, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, Belarus, and Russia, has repeatedly participated in the process, received the statements of NGOs and UN agencies publicly posted in the process, and subjected itself to a dialogue on its human rights record in which every other UN member, including the US, European Union members, and other democracies actively participate. Every one has received recommendations for improving human rights compliance, end quote. This passage is so important because what it shows is that the United States is the world's leading violator of human rights. Of all of the countries in the world, the U.S. is a genocidal rogue regime that spits in the face of international law and refuses to abide by international law. Meanwhile, U.S. adversaries like China, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, Belarus, and Russia, they are participating in these United Nations bodies. They are participating in the UN Human Rights Review every 4.5 years. It is the U.S. that is not doing it. It's the U.S. that is trying to sabotage the UN. Well, Washington's adversaries, who were told supposedly, according to Western propaganda, are authoritarian regimes and violate human rights. They're the ones that are actually upholding human rights more than the genocidal rogue regime in Washington, the United States of America. This is the reality in the world. The genocidal U.S. rogue regime is the biggest violator of international law. It's the biggest violator of human rights. The U.S. has invaded dozens of countries just in my lifetime. Iraq 2 times, Afghanistan, Libya, attacking Syria, Yemen, dozens of other countries with not only military interventions, but coups, regime change operations, illegal sanctions that violate international law. No other country comes even remotely close to the blood-soaked crimes of the genocidal U.S. rogue regime. And we now see that it's sponsoring another genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. And all international legal experts are saying it very clearly. This is the true face of the U.S. empire. And yes, Donald Trump is very explicit about it. He says, We are an empire. We don't care about international law. We don't care about this propaganda about democracy and human rights. He has lifted the veil. He has taken the mask off of the U.S. empire and showed its true face. But this did not start with Donald Trump. Joe Biden was basically doing the same thing as Trump, but he was using this ridiculous Orwellian propaganda rhetoric of democracy and human rights and multilateralism, like Barack Obama. But go back to George Bush in the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003. Go back to the Vietnam War, the Korean War. This is the true face of the U.S. empire. Trump is the true face of the genocidal U.S. rogue regime. And finally, more and more people around the world are waking up to it because it's become completely impossible to go along with the previous illusion in the 1990s that the U.S. was supporting democracy and human rights. No one actually believes this propaganda anymore, which is why even Trump and the U.S. government, officials in Washington, are no longer even pretending to care about this illusion. And this is why we desperately need a new multipolar world order in which the U.S. empire can no longer carry out all of these horrific crimes around the world. This is why we desperately need a new international system, an international political system, an international legal system, and an international financial system. These are the kinds of issues we talk about here regularly at Geopolitical Economy Report. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.